The late afternoon sun bathed the garden in a warm golden hue. Rows of white chairs were filled with smiling guests, some dabbing away tears of joy as soft music played. Flower petals lined the aisle, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves above. Everything looked perfect, like something out of a fairy tale. At the front stood a man in a crisp navy blue tuxedo, nervously adjusting his cufflinks. He smiled, though his eyes darted around, scanning the crowd. This was his big day. He was moments away from marrying the woman of his dreams, or so it seemed. The crowd stood as the music shifted to the familiar wedding march. All heads turned. There she was, the bride. Dressed in a stunning lace gown, her smile lit up the entire garden. Her dark hair was pinned back in soft curls, and her eyes sparkled as she clutched her bouquet. But instead of walking alone or with her father, her small son, a boy no older than 6, walked by her side. Dressed in a miniature tuxedo, he looked like a little prince, his expression serious. Everyone sighed at the sweet image of mother and son walking together. But if they had looked closer, they would have noticed something strange. The boy wasn't smiling. His little hand clutched his mother's tightly, and his eyes, wide and glassy, kept flicking toward the man waiting at the altar. His steps grew slower as they neared the front. The bride noticed and leaned down to whisper, "What's wrong, baby?" He didn't answer. He just shook his head. Then, just steps from the altar, the boy stopped. Dead in his tracks. The music continued, but the moment felt frozen in time. "Don't marry him," he said, his voice soft but firm. The guests turned to each other in confusion. The bride blinked, unsure if she'd heard him right. She leaned closer. "What did you say?" He looked up at her, eyes brimming with tears. "Mommy, don't marry him." Gasps echoed through the crowd. The groom's face paled. He tried to laugh it off. "Hey, buddy, you nervous?" he said, forcing a smile. But the boy stepped in front of his mother, as if shielding her. "He's not nice," the boy said louder. "He yells when you're not around. He called me names. He said you'd forget about me after you marry him." The bride's eyes widened, stunned. "Is this true?" she asked, turning to the man she was about to marry. The groom's face contorted. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. People began murmuring. Her sister stepped forward from the front row, pulling the boy gently into her arms. The bride, still trying to understand, looked at her fiancé again. "Answer me." Instead, he stepped back. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "He's a kid. He doesn't know what he's talking about." But his voice cracked, and his hands trembled. The truth was written all over his face. He had been cruel when no one was watching. He had underestimated the boy, thinking he wouldn't speak up, or wouldn't be believed. Then, in a moment that would be talked about for years, the groom turned and bolted. He ran down the aisle past the guests, knocking over a flower stand as he went. People gasped and stood aside. He didn't look back. Silence followed, heavy and sharp. The bride stood there, frozen, her veil catching the breeze. Then slowly, she turned to her son, who was now crying quietly into her sister's shoulder. She knelt down and gathered him into her arms. "I'm so sorry," she whispered into his hair. "I didn't know. You were so brave. You saved me." She looked out at the guests, family, friends, strangers. Some were still in shock. Others smiled gently, knowingly. The truth had come out. The wedding was over, but something far more important had been salvaged: trust. A mother's trust in her son. A child's voice finally heard. Later that evening, when the guests had gone home and the decorations were being taken down, the bride sat on a bench in her gown, her shoes off, holding her son close. The sunset was brilliant behind them. Life wouldn't go the way she had planned, but maybe that was okay. "I'll never let anyone come between us again," she promised. And her son, small but wise beyond his years, simply nodded. "I know, Mommy." And together, they walked away, not toward a reception, but toward something stronger. A new beginning. The house felt different when they returned that evening. The silk ribbons from the morning celebration still clung to the staircase, and a few unopened gifts lay in the corner of the living room, reminders of what was supposed to be a celebration. The bride, Natalie, stepped out of her shoes, her gown still flowing behind her like a ghost of the day that never happened. Her son, Eli, clutched her hand tightly. The silence in the house was a stark contrast to the chaos of the afternoon. Natalie had said very little since they left the garden, but her mind raced. Her heart was a war zone of confusion, guilt, anger, and, above all, gratitude. Gratitude for the little voice that had spoken up when no one else could. Eli climbed onto the couch and hugged a pillow to his chest. He had been so brave, more than any 6-year-old should have to be. Natalie sat beside him and brushed a curl from his forehead. "You okay?" she asked softly. Eli nodded, but his eyes didn't meet hers. "Are you mad?" Natalie blinked. "Mad? At you? Oh, sweetheart, never." She pulled him into her lap. "You were the only one who saw the truth. I should have seen it too. I should have listened sooner." Eli leaned into her. "He said you'd choose him. That you'd forget me." Natalie felt tears rise again. She kissed the top of his head. "There's no one in the world I love more than you. No one comes before you, ever." For the first time all day, Eli smiled. The following days were hard. Word of what happened spread quickly. Guests gossiped. Friends texted awkward apologies or asked probing questions. Natalie didn't respond. Instead, she focused on Eli. They spent long mornings making pancakes, taking walks to the park, building blanket forts, and, most importantly, talking. Natalie finally asked the hard questions. "When did he start saying those things to you?" Eli hesitated. "After he moved in. At first, he was nice. But then he got mad when I spilled juice. He said I ruined everything. One time, he locked me in my room when you were at work." Natalie felt sick. Her chest tightened. She had trusted that man, Greg. She had believed his lies. She had ignored the uneasy gut feelings and brushed off her sister's concerns. But now it was clear, Eli had been suffering in silence. The guilt was heavy, but Natalie knew she couldn't let it break her. She needed to be stronger than ever, for Eli. 1 week later, Natalie filed a report. She spoke to a lawyer, got Greg's name off everything, the lease, the bank account, the emergency contacts at Eli's school. She learned Greg had done this before. He had a sealed record involving an ex in another state. It all made sense now. The charm, the love bombing, the quick move-in, the subtle isolation. But not this time. This time, someone stood up to him. Part 3, The Bravest Voice. Months passed. Spring turned into summer. Natalie's wedding dress stayed boxed in the attic. She didn't have the heart to sell it yet. Maybe someday. One Saturday morning, she and Eli visited a community center that was hosting a children's story hour. The room was filled with laughter and crayons. As Eli settled in with other kids, Natalie sipped coffee and sat with other parents. A woman nearby smiled warmly. "Your son's the one who, well, stopped a wedding, right?" Natalie's cheeks flushed. "Yes. That was us." The woman's smile didn't fade. "I think what he did was incredible. My daughter went through something similar and didn't say anything for years. She's healing now, but, your son? He's a hero." Natalie swallowed back tears. It still caught her off guard, how powerful the truth could be. Later that day, Natalie asked Eli if he remembered the wedding. "A little," he said. "I remember you were really pretty. And I was scared. But I'm glad I said it." "So am I," she whispered. That night, Natalie sat at her computer and began writing. Not just emails or updates, but a letter. A story. One that began, "My 6-year-old son saved me from marrying a monster." She didn't know if she'd ever publish it, but it felt like the start of something. Part 4, Moving Forward. By the end of summer, Eli was starting first grade. He was still the same sweet, curious boy, but more confident now. He spoke up more. He helped younger kids on the playground. And sometimes, at night, he'd tell his mom, "I protected you." And Natalie would nod, kiss his forehead, and say, "Yes, you did." She was healing too. She had started volunteering at a women's support center, sharing her experience with others who had almost made the same mistake, or had gone through worse. Every now and then, someone would ask if she was dating again. She'd smile politely and say, "Not right now. I've got someone much more important to focus on." And every time, that someone would come running down the hall, arms open, yelling, "Mom!" The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant chimney smoke as Natalie stood by the window, watching Eli run through the small backyard. His laughter echoed off the fences, a sound so full of life and freedom that it made her heart ache with both joy and sorrow. There were still moments when she would catch herself wondering how close she had come to losing him, not physically, but emotionally. How many smiles would have dimmed under the weight of fear? How many quiet cries behind closed doors might she have never heard if he hadn't been brave enough to speak up that day? Those questions haunted her less than they used to, but sometimes they crept back in, unwelcome and persistent. Life had settled into a new rhythm. It was slower, gentler, and more intentional. Natalie had taken a leave of absence from her job in marketing and started working part-time from home, taking freelance clients who respected her boundaries. Her mornings now began with pancakes and cartoons rather than rush commutes, and her evenings ended with storybooks and warm blankets, not exhaustion and forced conversations. The quiet gave her time to think, to breathe, and to rebuild not only her life but her sense of self, a woman who had once confused manipulation for love, control for care. She no longer walked on eggshells or second-guessed her instincts. And slowly, that strength had begun to grow roots in Eli, too. Eli had blossomed in school. His teacher had described him as watchful but kind, and while he was sometimes quiet, he had made a few good friends who understood that he didn't like to be teased or pushed. Natalie had spoken to the school counselor early in the year, sharing just enough of their story to ensure that Eli would be safe, understood, supported. What surprised her most was how often he didn't need help. He had a resilience inside him, a spark that hadn't been extinguished. She could see it in the way he stood up for a classmate being picked on, or in the way he always sat beside the boy with glasses during lunch, the one everyone else ignored. Natalie often wondered if, in some strange and painful way, what they had gone through had forged something strong in her son, not just fear, but empathy. But healing wasn't a straight road. There were nights Eli would wake from dreams he couldn't explain, crawling into her bed and holding her tightly without speaking. Natalie would rub his back and whisper, "You're safe now," until his breathing slowed. Once, while shopping, they passed a man who wore the same cologne Greg had used, sharp and musky. Eli froze, gripping her hand, eyes wide in panic. Natalie didn't hesitate. She knelt beside him and said, "We can leave. Right now. We don't ever have to stay where you're scared." And they did. They walked out of that store without another thought. Because no errand, no grocery list, no task was more important than his peace. One chilly November afternoon, Natalie received a letter. It came in a plain envelope with no return address. Her hands trembled as she opened it, already knowing before she read the first word. It was from Greg. She read it once, twice, then a third time. The tone was cold, calculated, an attempt at apology that quickly turned to blame. He claimed he had been misunderstood, that she had overreacted, and that she had allowed a child to ruin everything. Natalie felt an old anger flicker to life, but it didn't consume her this time. She placed the letter down calmly, took a photo of it for records, then tore it in half and burned it in the sink. The ashes swirled down the drain like a bad memory finally being rinsed away. She never told Eli. He didn't need that weight. He had carried enough already. As winter approached, Natalie began to write again. Not just journal entries or private letters, but essays, short stories, reflections on motherhood and survival. One night, after Eli had fallen asleep with his toy train still clutched in his hand, she stayed up until dawn, typing the final words of a piece titled "My Son Taught Me How to Listen." She submitted it anonymously to an online magazine. A week later, it was published, and it went viral. Messages poured in. Mothers, fathers, survivors, teachers. Strangers from across the country thanked her for putting into words the very thing they had lived through but could never say out loud. She read every single one. She cried. She smiled. And slowly, her silence began to matter less than her voice. One evening, long after the first snow had dusted their street, Natalie sat by the window again, watching Eli build a crooked snowman with two mismatched gloves. She had just finished a Zoom interview with a non-profit that wanted her to speak at an upcoming conference on emotional abuse and children's voices. The woman had said, "We don't usually invite non-clinicians, but your story, your son's courage, we need people to hear it." Natalie had hesitated. Public speaking terrified her. But then she remembered Eli's tiny voice at the altar, trembling yet loud, scared yet strong. If he could do that, she could do this. Later, she made hot cocoa, topped with too many marshmallows, just the way Eli liked it. As they sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket, watching snow fall through the window, Eli leaned his head on her shoulder and said, "Do you think we'll always be just us?" The day Eli left for college was quiet. Not somber, not dramatic, just quiet. The kind of quiet that happens after a long rain, when the earth is still damp but the sky is finally clear. Natalie stood by the car, watching as he loaded the last box into the trunk. He moved with the confidence of someone who had come into himself, shoulders broader, eyes steady, Every inch of him a young man who had known what it was to grow in the shadow of pain but choose the light anyway. She didn't cry at first. She smiled, asked if he had packed enough socks, if he remembered the folder with his financial aid papers, if he needed her to come up and help him unpack. Eli just chuckled, gave her a look, the one that said, "Mom, I got this," and wrapped his arms around her. He was taller than her now, by more than a little. But she still felt, for a brief second, the weight of the little boy who once held her hand in a chapel and said, "Don't marry him." Now, here he was, standing at the edge of a new life. A life she had fought for. A life he had helped her rebuild. As he pulled away from the driveway, she didn't chase the car down the street or wave until it disappeared. She simply stood still, her hand on her chest, breathing. When the car turned the corner and was gone, she walked back inside. The house felt different. Not empty. Just ready. Ready for the next version of her life. In the weeks that followed, Natalie began to move through the rooms with a new energy. She cleaned the spare bedroom, turned it into a quiet writing space, finally framed the cover of her book and hung it by the window. She went on long walks alone, not because she was lonely, but because she wanted to, because for the first time, her days weren't filled with worry or waiting for the next bad thing to happen. Her life was no longer on pause. It was in motion, steady and free. Daniel was still in her life, steady, dependable, kind. They never did marry, and Natalie liked it that way. They had built a relationship not out of obligation or tradition, but choice. Every day he showed up with gentleness, and every day she chose to meet him with trust. They traveled now, small trips, quiet places. Once, on a beach at sunset, Daniel had asked her, "Do you think this is our forever?" She had smiled and replied, "I think it's our today. And I love it enough that I'll want tomorrow too." And Eli, he flourished. His college years were marked by discovery. He joined student leadership, worked with advocacy groups for children affected by domestic violence, even led workshops in local schools about speaking up and setting boundaries. He never told his full story to crowds, but he told enough, and always with a gentle strength that made people listen. Natalie would sometimes get emails from his professors or mentors, saying, "Your son has a gift." She would smile at the screen and whisper, "I know." Years passed. Not quickly, not slowly, just steadily. Eli graduated, found his calling in social work, and one day, he stood in Natalie's kitchen with a nervous smile and said, "I think I met someone." Her heart clenched, not with fear but with awe, because he had learned how to love without fear. He had learned to trust not in perfection, but in presence. Eventually, Natalie grew older, her hair silvering, her pace slowing, but her spirit never dimming. She became a mentor to younger women, sharing her story in quiet circles, listening more than she spoke. She never tried to be a hero. She just wanted to be honest, and in that honesty, she gave others the permission to begin again. One spring morning, many years later, Natalie and Eli sat together on the same porch where they had once built Lego castles and read bedtime stories. The world was quiet around them. Eli's hand rested on his mother's, now a bit more fragile, but still warm and strong. "You saved me, you know," he said quietly. Natalie shook her head. "No. You saved me. You were the first person who ever stood up for me, even when I didn't know I needed saving." They sat in silence for a long while. The wind moved through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a child's laughter rang out, clear, bright, free. Natalie looked toward the sound, then turned back to her son. "We broke the cycle," she said. "You and me." Eli nodded, tears in his eyes. "Yeah, we did." And in that moment, not dramatic or loud, but deeply real, Natalie knew that the story was complete. Not because everything was perfect, but because they had taken the pain, the loss, the fear, and turned it into love. Into truth. Into a legacy that would echo long after the last page. A story that began with a little boy at the end of an aisle, and ended with 2 lives fully lived. The end. The years slipped by in quiet ripples. Before she realized it, Natalie found herself standing in the doorway of Eli's room one morning, watching a boy who now towered several inches taller than her button-up a dress shirt for his first high school debate tournament. He adjusted his collar twice before sighing and calling out, "Mom, can you fix this? I'm not going to school looking like I slept in this thing." She smiled as she walked over and smoothed the fabric around his neck, her hands moving with the ease of a mother who had dressed a child through every season of life. But this was different. This wasn't a boy needing to be rescued anymore. This was a young man learning to stand on his own, learning to ask for help not out of fear, but confidence. Eli had grown into himself in ways Natalie could never have imagined when he was that small, trembling voice in the chapel so many years ago. He had learned to speak, not just out loud, but with purpose. He joined the speech team, not because he loved arguing, but because he had something to say. And when he spoke, people listened. His first speech was about courage, and though he never mentioned Greg by name, Natalie knew exactly who he was talking about when he said, "Sometimes, courage is just telling the truth when no one else wants to hear it." She sat in the back of the auditorium with tears streaming down her face, surrounded by strangers who clapped politely, never knowing that the boy on stage had once saved them both with a single sentence. At home, their life had settled into something that resembled peace. Daniel had become a fixture in their lives, slowly but steadily. He never moved in, and Natalie never asked him to. They found comfort in closeness with room for air, space to grow without pressure to fuse. Daniel was patient, understanding, and most importantly, he never tried to be a replacement. He was there when needed and invisible when not. Eli called him D, and though he never used the word stepdad, he gave him Father's Day cards with quiet, handwritten notes inside. "Thanks for showing me what real strength looks like." There were still hard days, of course. Some scars never fully faded. Once, during a school project, Eli had to research family histories, and he came home distant, distracted. Natalie sat with him in the kitchen, listening as he tried to explain how strange it felt not knowing how to describe Greg, whether to write father or leave the space blank. "You can write what's true," she said softly. "Not what they expect. Maybe that's nothing. Maybe that's he used to be. That's okay." And Eli, after a moment of silence, simply nodded. Later that night, he typed, "My father is a part of my history, but he is not my family." Natalie, meanwhile, had quietly become something of a voice in the advocacy world. Her anonymous essays had turned into speaking invitations, and eventually, she'd been asked to co-author a book about identifying emotional abuse in domestic partnerships. She never shared her full story in public. Not yet. But her words found people who needed them. Letters poured in. One woman wrote, "You made me realize it wasn't my fault. My daughter and I are safe now. Thank you for your bravery." Natalie saved that letter in a small wooden box next to Eli's baby shoes and the tiny bow tie he wore that fateful day. Not as trophies, but as reminders. And yet, despite the good, there was still a quiet tension that sometimes crept in like a draft through a cracked window. Eli had begun to ask deeper questions, not just about their past, but about her. "Do you ever want to get married again?" he asked one evening, while they folded laundry together. Natalie paused, blinking at the question. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Maybe. But it would have to be different this time. Not a rescue. Not a promise. Just a choice. Every day. Freely made." Eli nodded, then tossed a pair of socks into the basket. "If you ever do, make sure he's scared of you a little." She laughed, a full, belly laugh that felt like exhale. "Deal." As Eli grew older, his independence became more visible. He got a part-time job at a used bookstore, joined a local youth mentorship group, and began talking about college, not as a vague someday, but as a near horizon. Natalie supported him at every step, but inside, she quietly mourned the vanishing childhood years. The late-night talks. The hand that used to reach for hers when crossing a street. Still, she knew this was the goal. Not just survival, but launch. She wasn't raising a boy to keep. She was raising a man to release. On his 17th birthday, Natalie took him to a nearby lake, a place they used to visit when things were hard. They sat on the weathered dock with their feet dangling just above the water. The sky was wide and quiet. Eli turned to her and said, "I remember thinking this was the safest place in the world. Because no one yelled here." Natalie felt the ache of that truth settle deep in her ribs. "It still is," she said. "As long as you want it to be." He nodded. "I think I'll always come back here. Even when I leave." Natalie smiled at him, proud and bittersweet. "Then I'll always be waiting." The sun sank low over the water, casting a golden sheen that made everything shimmer like a memory. Mother and son sat side by side, no longer afraid of the shadows behind them, no longer uncertain of who they were or what they deserved. They had lived through something most people never fully understand. And yet, here they were, whole, changed, and still growing. The story wasn't finished. Not even close. But it had transformed into something neither of them had expected, not a tragedy, but a legacy. One that started with a little boy's brave words and continued every day they chose truth over fear, love over silence, and healing over hiding. Natalie smiled and kissed the top of his head. Maybe. But even if someone comes along, they'll have to love you first. And if they don't, they're not staying. He thought for a moment, then nodded. Okay. But I like it just us. So do I, she whispered. The fire crackled softly in the background. Outside, the world was quiet, blanketed in white. Inside, a mother and son sat together, scarred but safe, tired but stronger than ever. Their story wasn't over. But for the first time in a long while, Natalie was no longer afraid of what the next chapter would bring. The summer that followed was the warmest in years. Golden light bathed the neighborhood each morning, and the sun lingered late into the evening like it, too, was reluctant to say goodbye. For Natalie, it was the first summer in a long time where each day didn't feel like a quiet war between pretending everything was fine and the fear that everything would fall apart. There was no pretending anymore. Just truth, raw, complicated, sometimes painful, but real. She'd made a life for herself, and Eli built on honesty, not illusion. And now that the dust had long settled, she could breathe without flinching. Eli was growing up so quickly. There was something different about him now, a boy still, but taller, more thoughtful, and often quiet in a way that made Natalie study him, wondering what thoughts lived behind those large, observant eyes. He still loved comics and forts and chocolate chip pancakes, but he asked more questions than before, questions about the world, about people, about fairness. And sometimes, when they were brushing their teeth side by side in the evening, he would glance at her in the mirror and say something like, "Mom, do you think we get stronger after we get hurt?" She would pause, toothbrush in midair, and meet his gaze. "Yes," she'd say. "But only if we heal. And only if we learn." One day, as they were cleaning out the attic, Eli came across a dusty box tucked behind old holiday decorations. Inside it was her wedding dress, carefully folded but forgotten. For a moment, Natalie felt the air leave her lungs. She had almost thrown it away so many times. But she never did. Maybe because a small part of her needed to remember how close she had come to giving her life away. Eli lifted the delicate fabric gently, as if afraid it might break. "Is this what you were going to wear when you married him?" he asked. His voice was calm, almost clinical. Natalie nodded. "Yes. I never got to wear it, really. Just for a little while." Eli looked at the dress, then at her. "It's pretty. But you're prettier now." She laughed, caught off guard by the unexpected sweetness. "Thanks," she said, brushing his hair back. "You saved me from needing to wear it. I think I owe you more than one thank you for that." He grinned and stuffed it back in the box. "Let's sell it. Or turn it into a tent." Natalie smiled. That evening, after dinner, they sat on the porch with the box between them. They didn't talk much, but they didn't have to. Sometimes, healing didn't need grand gestures or perfect words. Sometimes, it was in the silence, the way a mother and son could sit with the past without letting it define them. Daniel was still around, not often, not overwhelmingly, but just enough. Sometimes Natalie would see him at the bookstore cafe. Other times they crossed paths at the farmer's market. Every now and then, he would invite them to small community events, a children's book reading, a school fundraiser, a park cleanup. Never more than that. He never asked too much, never overstepped. Natalie appreciated his patience. She appreciated even more that Eli seemed to accept his presence without shrinking away. There were even small signs of trust, the way Eli let Daniel help him tie a kite string when it knotted, or the way he accepted a hot cocoa from him on a cold afternoon without glancing at Natalie first. These were quiet victories, the kind that meant everything. Still, Natalie didn't rush anything. She had spent too many years learning how to listen to the small voices, her son's, her own, the ones she used to silence. Now, every decision passed through a slow, thoughtful filter. Was this person kind when no one was watching? Did he respect boundaries? Did he accept no as an answer without resentment? Did he see Eli not as an obstacle but as someone worth knowing, worth protecting? So far, Daniel was ticking the boxes, not by what he said, but by what he didn't say. He didn't try to fill silence. He didn't pretend to understand their pain. He simply showed up, consistently and calmly, without expecting anything in return. That fall, Eli started a new grade with a new teacher and made a new friend, a boy named Malik who loved robots and hated broccoli. The two became inseparable. Natalie met Malik's mother, a warm woman named Adira who ran a small jewelry stall at the weekend market. They quickly bonded over shared stories of motherhood, exhaustion, and cautious hope. One evening, over tea, Adira said. You seem like someone who's been through something, but came out better. Natalie didn't explain. She just smiled. I'm trying, she replied. As October turned to November, the winds grew sharper and the trees let go of their leaves. On one particularly crisp afternoon, Natalie and Eli joined Daniel and his niece and nephew at the local orchard. It wasn't a date, not exactly, but it was something. The kids ran ahead with baskets, trying to find the biggest apples, while Natalie and Daniel walked behind, talking quietly. At one point, Daniel stopped and turned to her. You know, he said, you don't have to let me in. Not ever. But if you do, I promise, I'll never make you regret it. Natalie looked at him, her heart not pounding but steady. There were no butterflies. Just warmth. Calm. A sense of rightness. I'll think about it, she said. And he smiled, because he knew that was more than enough. That night, after Eli fell asleep with grass still stuck to his socks and apple juice on his shirt, Natalie sat alone on the porch with a blanket around her shoulders. She watched the stars, listened to the wind rustle through nearly bare branches, and thought about everything they had survived, not just the obvious dangers, but the subtle ones. The kind that disguise themselves as love, as normal, as fine. She thought about how far she and her son had come, and how far they might still go. And she realized something: they weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. There would always be shadows, memories, moments of fear, traces of pain. But now, there was light, too. Real light. Earned light. And for the first time in years, Natalie felt something else returning. Not fear. Not numbness. But hope. Hope, and the deep, unwavering love of a child who once stood at the end of an aisle and said, "Don't marry him," and in doing so, gave them both a second chance at life.